No, I'm curious. Yeah, we didn't even end up finding, we had a snowball fight. And play capture the flag for a half hour because there's 3 inches of snow on the building. It was absolutely great. And then we took a photo of it. We were like, here we are this morning. Oh yeah, this is the 25. Like, look at the film. All right, early this morning.
All right, well, good morning. Thank you for making it today. That's a fun way to wake up in early November. How many people are here? Like, this is your first time really getting snow out here in LeGrand? People who are new in town. A couple of you. Yeah. So was not expecting to have this conversation in the fall, but to give you a general sense of policy between now and the end of the term, thank you for making it. I hope you were able to get in safely. Big thing I want to emphasize is that I never want you to feel like you need to come to class in a way that is unsafe or inaccessible for you. If you find yourself in that position where you're not able to safely come to class, what you can always do is just send me an email, and what I will do is send you the Zoom link for that class meeting so that you can join us remotely, right? So that's something that I generally offer if you're sick, not able to come to class and so on, right? Just let me know if you're not able to make it. You're welcome to join remotely. And again, I'll have the recording and slides up if you can't join remotely either. So again, don't want you to hurt yourself coming to class. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you can't safely make it, just let me know so that you can get that invitation to come in remotely. So in any case, thank you for coming in and joining us for today. Also in general, right, we're going to follow just EOU's guidelines on closure, right? So I woke up this morning and there was no closure update. They have an info line where if you call the number, right, it'll let you know if there are any closures. You should expect to receive phone call, text, and email updates from EOU if there are closures. So I just recommend checking that, which will keep you updated. Generally speaking, they'll let you know as early as like 6 a.m. If they do have closures for the day. So I definitely recommend checking that as well. Okay, so let's take a couple minutes to talk about this practice question. This question connects to social penetration theory that we talked about last class. So Rebecca is sharing some of her favorite and least favorite kinds of music with Richard. Which stage is social penetration theory best describes their relationship? Either stable, affective, exploratory affective, or orientation. Take a couple minutes on that, and then we'll chat about this question together.
It's 100%. And then it's like 80%.
All right. Anybody who'd like some more time on this one? Okay, let's chat about this. So social penetration theory has 5 different stages. Of these 5, which do you feel like best describes this relationship? How many people think A, stable, B, affective, C, exploratory affective, or D, orientation? So I saw some hands that were kind of up in between these two. So the best answer here is C, exploratory affective, right? In the affective stage, you can think about that as the very basic demographic information. What is your name? What are your hobbies? And so on, right? Exploratory affective is when you start to offer your opinion and perspective on superficial and non-confrontational topics. So things like your favorite music, generally speaking, is probably not confrontational, although if you have some like really strong feelings about Taylor Swift, I guess it might be controversial. And then stable, right, is generally speaking openly about things. Orientation, or sorry, other way around. Exploratory affective are those superficial details. Affective is starting to get into more details. So C is the best answer here. So I want to give a reminder for everybody that Monday is when winter registration opens. In particular, it opens at 6 a.m. and I do recommend registering as soon as you can for courses that you plan to take. A lot of courses, especially a lot of remote and online courses, tend to fill up really, really quickly. So I do recommend starting to look into those. I do want to point to some of the courses in particular that you might want to consider within communication. So if you're a communication major or minor, or you're just interested in taking more communication courses, I wanted to do a super quick walkthrough of some of the courses that we have on offer for the winter. So you can access this pretty easily through Mountie Hub. So we have a number of sections of public speaking. Public speaking is one of the core courses for our major, but there's also a good gateway course that you can take. Be teaching the face-to-face section. There's a couple online sections. There's communication design, also small group, which is part of the major requirements as well, which I'll be teaching 2 sections of face-to-face in the winter. It's a course that in many ways builds on some of the things that we've been talking about here. We have conflict management, which is a great course to take for lower division UWR, university writing requirement. We have foundations of digital media, which is a core course for majors. Intercultural, and speaking in modern organizations. Are You Listening is another course that offers some really good general education credit. We have a course on interviewing, advertising, and so on. So just wanted to highlight that for you. This participatory culture course is also pretty popular. So the courses that I'll be teaching this winter are public speaking, 1 section face-to-face, and then 2 sections of small group communication. So those courses are interesting, or any other courses that we have are interesting to you, just letting you know what we have on the docket. So last class, we talked about social penetration theory. Again, you can think about Shrek loudly yelling that I have layers as he's holding an onion to remember this theory. We also talked about the Johari window, right? The known unknowns, the elements of ourselves that we understand through our disclosure. And then lastly, we talked about some starting points on listening. Any questions about anything we talked about last class, anything more generally about the course. Again, as a reminder for folks who might have just come in, if I want you to be safe. If you can't safely come to class, email me and I'll send you a Zoom. So today we're going to be talking about the taxonomy of listening, a way of sorting and categorizing why we listen and why that matters. We'll be talking about how we respond to listening, and then we'll talk about some of the ways that we engage through listening and culture, perception, and so on, doing an activity that explores that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so we have yet another pyramid. So this is not different types of communication or massive hierarchy, but this pyramid describes the taxonomy of listening. Right? The taxonomy of listening, you can think about as establishing a baseline for why it is that we choose to listen and engage with others. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, right, in order for us to achieve something like self-actualization or some of our belonging and social needs, right, we've got to get those core safety needs first. We've got to get food and water, or if we need to go to the bathroom, we've got to go do that before we're willing to have a casual conversation with friends, right? In the same way, we have to meet this baseline before we as listeners are able to reach some of those higher levels. And listening, again, is up to 50% of what we do day to day, right? A lot of conversations inevitably mean that we're put into the role of listeners, give or take. So listening is a crucial skill for us when we're in professional context, right? Being good at listening, being detail-oriented are things that employers always want. But listening is also important because it helps us to better develop our relationships. A lot of us think we're good listeners, but turn out not to be, or have things that we can continue to work on. So the level of taxonomy is based on the work needed to understand the message. So the further up you go, right, the further work is required to fully engage with and relate to that message. And the type of listening that we do, especially here at the very top, right, is impacted by elements such as context and situation. For instance, if you're looking to vent, somebody who's using the more critical listening approach is probably not a good fit for you. So oftentimes we're adjusting our listening to account for some of the nonverbal cues and information that we pick up on from other people. So let's break this down a little bit. So at the very bottom here, we have this idea of discriminative listening. I'll give you one example, right? If you have an email address, there's a good chance that your EOU email, right, filters and sorts out spam. I get weird spam messages all the time. In fact, one of the most common ones that I get are like predatory publishers who are like, hey, and then oftentimes the page is blank, they don't have my name. They're like, you should submit to this conference. It's not at all sketchy. It doesn't cost $800 to register or no, right? Spam messages, content like that, we filter out either algorithmically through email or we filter it out ourselves. If we're deleting parts of our inbox, we're sorting through messages and so on. In the same way, right, we discriminate messages that we hear as we're communicating with other people. Maybe you put on headphones, maybe really focus and lean in to talk to somebody if they're talking to you in a crowded setting, right? We use discriminative listening because if we listen to everything all the time, that would be an absolute overload for us and we could not understand the message. So we use auditory and visual stimuli, right? We use elements of nonverbal communication such as gestures and physicality, but we also use the voice, tone of voice, and the language being said. And we try to figure out what we should actually pay attention to. Again, if you're in a crowded building, you're focusing on that person you're having talk with. If we do that, right, if we can attend to and focus on the message, we move up to comprehensive listening. If we think about this idea of comprehending, right, this idea of reading comprehension, for example, which you might be familiar with if you've taken like a standardized test, that refers not only to your ability to read the message, but to understand and really think about what that message is trying to say, right? So for instance, maybe you're reading a news article and you think that that news article is offering a political slant and it's not neutral, right? That would be at this comprehensive listening role to understand what information is being given here, right? So do you comprehend the information? Can you relay that information back in your own words? That would be this middle stage here. So if you have met those steps, if you can identify the message and you can make sense of what that message is trying to say, it becomes a choose your own adventure. You have 3 different types of listening that are happening above that that are dependent upon the context and situation. One of them is the idea of therapeutic listening. So one thing that I think happens in a lot of relationships is a disconnect in what it is that somebody wants as a result of venting or sharing diatribe, as we think about like a one-way competitive style of listening, right? Some people say, I just want to vent and I want somebody that can listen to me and be supportive and affirmative to my experience. I'm not asking for advice or feedback. I'm asking for somebody to listen. That would be therapeutic listening. This idea of serving as a sounding board and being available to support somebody else in the challenges and experiences that they're going through, right? A good thing to check in advance if somebody is going to vent is to see, would you like advice or would you like support? So that's the idea of therapeutic listening. Critical listening, right, is really trying to assess the message and the underlying values, beliefs, ideas, and correctness of that message. So for example, right, say you're working on a group project and one of your group members has been incredibly flaky. They don't answer emails, they don't respond when you try to reach out to them, they haven't been doing work on the project, and then they tell you, oh, don't worry, I'm going to get my slides in. I'm going to finish my part of the group project on time, right? A critical listener would look at that and say, based on the context and based on what I know about you, this is likely not going to happen, right? You're determining that this is not a valid message based on what you know about this person. Or again, if you look at The Onion, which is a satirical news site, right? You look at a headline and you say that headline is false with the context and information I know about this being the Onion. And then there's this idea of appreciative listening. So appreciative listening is the idea, if you're enjoying the message, right, that it's not necessarily about responding to the message outside of kind of some nonverbal confirmation or kind of internally enjoying it, right? Appreciative listening means that you are just enjoying what that message is, right? So maybe you just enjoy talking to your friends, spending time together, right? That's just an entertaining experience for you and you appreciate it. Or maybe you really like podcasts, video essays, radio, right? You like having that music and so on, and you just enjoy doing that, right? Or maybe you're interested in attending something like play or production that you have, that might fit under appreciative listening too, right? I'm a big fan of video essays. I watch a lot of video essays from like some of my favorite video games, right? That's an example of appreciative listening. So this taxonomy is helpful in, again, understanding that we have to meet some of those base requirements before we can reach those higher stages of listening. And we can choose among those 3, which makes the most sense based on context. We're generally not doing all 3 of those at once. We're picking one of those 3. We're utilizing one of those 3 that makes sense for the situation. So we have listening styles. Again, this is something that we were starting to talk about before the exam, but something that I want to hit on a bit more now. Because while there's a lot of variation across culture, context, gender, and so on, right? What studies have told us is that there are 4 major types of listeners. And generally speaking, right, things like context and situation might change the type of listener you are. For instance, maybe you find yourself a people-oriented listener with one person, and maybe you go to class or you go to work and you're much more time-oriented listener. So those things can definitely shape which of the listening styles you're more likely to use. But in general, people find themselves aligned toward one of these categories. The first category here is the idea of being a people-oriented listener. When we think about what it means to be a people-oriented listener, Generally speaking, these are folks who aren't as excited about the content of the message, right? If you are talking to a friend and catching up about how the school year is going for you, it's not necessarily that you want to know the nitty-gritty about what classes they're taking, right? You like the idea of catching up with them, seeing how they're doing and learning about them. In this case, people-oriented listeners are folks who are much more concerned with the people that are sending the message and building relationships with those people and understanding those people rather than the content of the message, right? So you're sharing, you're catching up. They're maybe less likely to recall the exact content, but they can definitely pick up on the feelings and experiences that somebody is sharing. Generally speaking, people-oriented listeners tend to be very empathic. That is, they're very good at understanding the emotional states of other people. So if somebody is sharing the classes and things going on in the fall term, and they seem like they're really kind of stressed and anxious, that's something a people-oriented listener would be really good at identifying. And in particular, people-oriented listeners are focused on relational maintenance. This idea of catching up with people, communicating with people, listening with people, is this idea of really trying to focus on developing the relationship through conversation and listening, right? Great to develop relationships, maybe struggles a little bit with remembering the exact content of that. Next, we have action-oriented listeners, right? So when you think about a very type A person, you might think about somebody like a supervisor or boss or coach who's very to the point. That'd be an example of an action-oriented listener, right? They want you to cut to the chase and get to the point. So oftentimes, action-oriented listeners are less patient, they're less willing to engage in things like small talk or introductions. They say, this meeting started, let's get going, right? Let's get rolling on this. So action-oriented listeners tend to be very efficient. They tend to be people in more leadership roles who occupy this very kind of nitty-gritty approach to things. They also tend to spill over a lot with time-oriented listeners, people who only have so much time to focus on an issue, right? One downside, of course, is that an action-oriented listener is less empathic. They're less understanding of what might cause somebody to be more hesitant. If somebody is meeting with you and maybe you seem a little bit anxious, or they're beating around the bush, or they're doing small talk, maybe that's the way that they're trying to open up the conversation and relate to you a little bit more, right? That might be something that action-oriented listeners are less sensitive to. Culture might also play a bit of a role as well. If there's higher context culture, right, where more of the subtle cues, elements of relational maintenance and creating casual conversation might be more important as well. Then we have content-oriented listeners, right? So content-oriented listeners are people who are really interested in what is in the message itself, right? They're interested in the information, less so than the people. In other words, if you met with a friend and you were asking how their classes were going, you really want to know how their classes are going. You want to know what classes they're taking. You want to know what they're planning on taking for the next term and so on. So you're really interested in gaining that information and processing that information too, right? So for instance, if you're doing something like a competitive debate, you are a content-oriented listener because you are trying to understand the message so that you can refute it. Somebody makes a claim, for example, a claim about the state of the economy, and you want to understand what their claim is in order to formulate a response to that claim. So content-oriented listeners tend to be really good at remembering, recalling, and figuring out the message. If you find yourself in a group and you're somebody that's taking notes for that group, you tend to be a content-oriented listener. Content-oriented listeners might also have trouble with understanding the role of things like casual conversation, right? The role of people in the conversation. Content-oriented listeners can also get a little bit bored if they find that the information being given is not very compelling or interesting or relevant to them, right? They really like getting into heady, kind of interesting topics. I'll give you one example. I'm definitely a content-oriented listener. And a few months ago, I actually saw Everything Everywhere All at Once for the first time. It's like in my top 3 favorite movies. My favorite movie is Arrival, but it's definitely up there. And the thing I wanted to do when I talked to my family was like immediately dig into the messages and ideas and the idea of parallel universes and multiverses as an exploration into nihilism and the human condition, and the idea that there is no inherent meaning to the universe, but that within the chaos of the decisions of our lives, that there's meaning that we can form for ourselves, that I found to be personally powerful. People didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to say, oh, that was fun, right? So content-oriented listener might take in a message and interpret that very differently. Lastly, we have the idea of a time-oriented listener. So time-oriented listener is somebody who's constantly watching the clock. So again, a lot of supervisors, people in positions of power or authority tend to be more time-oriented listeners. People who have a tight schedule, right, who really try to map things out, also fit under the idea of a time-oriented listener. Similar to action-oriented listeners, they want to get to the source or cut to the chase quickly. But more so, it's about the constraints of that meeting, right? Oftentimes, the listener needs to multitask. We've got a bunch of different things on their plate, right? They can slot you into a time. There might be a greater emphasis on punctuality coming into the meeting on time, right? So time-oriented listeners are very interested with how that time is managed and being used effectively. We might think about more formalized settings. For example, if you're meeting with a therapist, right? To some extent, they have to be a time-oriented listener because they only have the specific constraints of a session to do a meeting. So these 4 different listening styles are all good things to know and to better understand with regard to how it is that we listen. In addition to this, we have what are known as listening responses. So if we think about the role of feedback, right, the model of communication says not only that we communicate with people and that people respond to us, but that the method that somebody chooses to respond is really important. And again, we have to consider factors such as context and situation that shape the way that we might respond differently. We also do a lot of listening responses without thinking about it, right? Oftentimes, we will respond to a message in a more subtle way. So perhaps the most common is the idea of silent listening, where you don't really offer much in the way of verbal or nonverbal feedback, right? You're just taking in that message, and you're not really doing so with much response. You might nod, right? You might do a little bit of nonverbal feedback, but generally speaking, silent listening is a double-edged sword. On the one end, silent listening can be really respectful. If somebody is telling you a very challenging and difficult story in their lives, like they're undergoing treatment for cancer, right, you're going to want to really listen and show that you're listening. At the same time, silent listening can either be read as not really listening or paying attention, right, that you are not responding because you're focused on something else. Or there are times in which it feels like there should be a response that you should give, and you're not giving that response. If you had a family member who was talking about how they received a cancer diagnosis and underwent chemo, right, and you said or did nothing, at some point that would be concerning, right? You would want to show some level of empathy or care in your response to show that you're affected by this and that you care about the person. Questioning. So for those of you who were here on Wednesday when we did that telephone activity, you might remember that Sam asked a clarifying question as he was listening to Ollie's story about the deer, right? We use questioning to understand the situation better and try to make sure that we get those details, especially for content-oriented listeners. Although sometimes, right, we might not actually have a question, or we might not actually need clarification and choose to ask a question in order just to show that we're listening and paying attention to the content. You might get something, but ask a question just for the sake of showing that you understand what it is that they're saying. So for instance, you might say, oh, you said that you graduated in 2018, right? Very well knowing that that's when they graduated, just wanting to show that you care. Paraphrasing, right, is rephrasing in your own words what somebody said. So this is a way we can respond to listening that can be really useful in conflict situations, because when things get heated, right, oftentimes we don't really listen to each other very well or understand the other person's perspective. So paraphrasing can be a really useful strategy to show to the other person that you're interpreting that message correctly. So paraphrasing can be really useful. Empathizing, right, is again the Atticus Finch, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. So there's a really interesting discussion that I think a lot of communities have raised about how oftentimes if somebody is undergoing an experience and sharing that experience, that somebody will empathize by bringing up their own experience, not an attempt to be selfish or to direct the conversation somewhere else, but as part of a broader effort to show and that they relate to and to some extent have dealt with something. So if you were talking about how challenging it was to get to campus today and how weird the road conditions were, right? And your friend said, oh, I know, I dealt with this as well. That might be a way that you show empathy, right? You put yourself in that situation or you imagine what it would be like for that person. Supporting, right? Listening response generally is focused on showing care for the speaker. So you might say something like, you know, I'm so sorry you're going through that. Yeah, I know, right? It's so snowy out. That would be an example of offering support for that person. Analyzing is generally when you are using critical listening and offering advice, right? So analyzing could be if you're talking with a friend about whether or not you want to graduate this year or next year, right? And you're weighing those different options to determine when graduating makes the most sense to you. Evaluating is once you have understood the message and understood the various options, what should you do, right? So evaluating might say, you know what, from what you've told me, I think it's a really good idea for you to graduate this year. Let's just do it, right? So that would be offering that information. And then advising would be a more formal way in which you either counselor, recommend, or offer information that can help somebody else. So for instance, if a counselor is advising you to take a medication, right, or to give you a medical diagnosis on the basis of what you shared in that meeting, that would be an example of an advising listening response. So we listen, we hear a message, right, and we can hear at one of those three different levels. The way that we choose to respond to that message can be any one of these types of categories. So listening response really kind of captures that experience. One thing that I think is also useful to explore a little bit before we get to today's activity is the idea of perception and the ways in which perception shapes how we talk and listen, right? Perception, of course, is about how we organize, understand, and interpret information. But the information that we select, right, we use discriminative listening to try to figure out what messages to pay attention to. It's like the laundry, right? It's like sorting the laundry and sorting out the messages that you want to pay attention to. You organize, again, like the laundry, what goes in which basket, what clothes you hang up, what clothes you leave on the floor or put in a drawer, right? In the same way, we're choosing to organize the information that we have. Maybe we know, okay, my friend is venting. We interpret information, right? So we use the interpretation process to understand what somebody's trying to say based on their tone of voice and what we know about this person. They would like therapeutic listening. They don't really want advice. And then we also negotiate that message, right? We try to understand how we can meet the needs of that person and think about our own listening in the context of that person. So a really good example of this is to recognize that, hey, maybe you're a time-oriented listener, maybe oftentimes you're really concerned about cost, but somebody's sharing a really important story to you, and maybe you need a little bit more time to talk about this. You don't want to cut them off, you want to continue the conversation. That would be an example of how you use negotiating to perceive and make sense of that conversation. The last thing that I want to hit on here are factors that play a role in influencing perception and the perception process. And I want to show kind of a fun little clip that gets at some of the ways in which the perception process is at play in a lot of our conversations, right? So you know me, you know that I am a huge fan of Star Trek. And it's kind of become a bit of a meme, but there is an episode of a show in Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? And the entire premise of this episode of Star Trek, right, is the Captain Picard is visiting an alien planet, and he's communicating with an alien species, but the alien species can only communicate in metaphor, right? So the thing I find kind of fun and interesting is about how he is forced to communicate and try to understand the interactions between himself and this alien using only metaphor to engage.
His army with fists open. And strategy with fists open. With fists open. His army with fists closed. With fists closed. An army with fists open. To the enemy with fists closed. To attack. That's how he communicates by citing example.
Right, so kind of a fun example. Some of the makeup and all that's a little bit outdated, but you know, Star Trek. So I think this is a fun example here of the steps of the perception process, and factors such as culture is influencing perception, right? So Picard is trying to understand this alien that's on the planet. They're trying to work to fight. And in order to understand this alien, Darmok, he has to understand whether or not the fist is open or closed, what that means, right? And realizes that that's talking about the idea of an attack or talking about war, right? Oftentimes across language, across culture, as we're translating and trying to understand different material, we're looking at those factors that shape perception. We listen and pay attention in different ways. And again, we can think back to the metaphor of glasses, right? Our perception and our understanding and our framework for the world is like a pair of glasses that we have, right? The filter, the depth that you get in that information is all dependent upon your perception of the world. So factors that can influence our perception in the listening process include physiological. If you're hungry, if you're thirsty, if you're tired, that's going to impact how you understand and make sense of the message and the type of listening that you do. For example, you might have greater difficulty with discriminative listening if you're really tired and underslept and you're trying to understand all the information you're being given. Psychological elements, right? So if you're dealing with a lot of anxiety or you're in a really good mood, right? Your psychological or emotional state is going to impact how you perceive information. If you're really excited and somebody is telling you a serious story, you might try to dial back a bit more for therapeutic listening. Social elements shape our perception too. Again, we might think about how, depending upon the situation we find ourselves in, the type of listening that we do and how we understand listening look a little bit different. So for instance, if you're in a very rowdy group of people and people are kind of constantly talking over each other, you might realize that that's the norm and jump in the conversation in that way. And then that Star Trek example is an example of cultural influence on perception, that the humans, right, and this alien communicate differently because of the ways that they use language to engage, whether the use of direct language or the use of metaphor and what that metaphor stands for. So at the beginning of the episode, right, Picard thinks that that is just nonsense and that, you know, it's just incoherent, but then starts to realize and perceive and listen in a way that understands that ways of communicating look different across culture and context, and the metaphor is a method of communication to try to understand and engage with the needs of other people. So as we're listening to other people, we might be thinking about how those stages and experiences impact what type of listeners we are and some of the ways that we choose to listen. So what I'd like you to do now is take some time on your own to write or type. There are the 4 different listening styles that we've been talking about, which are people-oriented listeners, action-oriented, content, and time. And which of those four do you think best describes you? So tag yourself. And then think about these different kinds of listening responses that we've talked about. Which do you find yourself gravitating to and using the most? So take some time on your own to explore and think about this. Start to work on your response here. Thanks. when you have finished this part of the prompt, what I'd like you to do is find somebody else in the class who has a different listening style as you, and just take a moment to share some of the ways that you and that person listen.
Oh, we free have like six. Oh, wait. Oh. So, like before, so you have the full one, all the constant time. Especially when
Downtown. It's like, Saturday, nothing going on. I wasn't gonna say that.
I really decided
Is this the last part?
Yes.
That way you don't have so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Zeke. I appreciate that. Take another minute or so to wrap up here.
Or actually.
So how many folks found themselves primarily being people-oriented listeners? Okay. Time, content, action, maybe a mix. Yeah, so a lot of folks who had a bit of a mix. Interesting that there's a lot of time-oriented listeners. I think a lot of times, especially as a student, right, navigating your courses and your schedule and all of that, right, we have only so much time to do things, and I know our schedules can fill up really quickly. So continue to think about this and the ways that we choose to engage in listening. Just as a reminder, if you're doing this week's Canvas prompt, you have until Sunday, so you don't have to rush to get that in today. If you would like more time over the weekend. We spent time today talking about the taxonomy of listening, listening responses, and perception, all elements, of course, that are important to being good listeners. So next week, we're going to be looking at media and starting to talk about media's role in interpersonal communication. So please pass forward or email me your attendance. Stay safe out there. Have a great weekend. If you can't come to class safely on Monday, let me know and I'll send you a Zoom link. And I'll see you next week.
I'm usually going to be on campus anyways. My first class is